On a bright Sunday morning, Daniel and Grace's wedding at St. Matthew's seemed perfect until the pastor noticed something unusual about the bride that brought everything to a sudden halt. What followed was a moment that tested love, faith, and the power of truth. Before we dive into this remarkable story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The Church of St. Matthew's had never looked so alive. Its tall windows allowed the sunlight to pour through in warm golden streams, painting the wooden pews and the polished floor with a gentle glow. Bouquets of white lilies lined the aisle, their fragrance mingling with the faint scent of incense that lingered from the morning service. The townspeople filled the pews, dressed in their best attire, each face lit with excitement as they waited for the ceremony to begin. There was a feeling of unity, as though this was not simply the wedding of two individuals, but a celebration for the entire community. Daniel, the groom, was a man admired for his kindness and humility. As a school teacher, he had taught many of the children seated in the church that day, and their parents looked upon him with pride, knowing that he had become a man of principle and patience. Beside him stood his best man, a childhood friend who tried to steady Daniel's nerves with whispered jokes, though Daniel's broad smile betrayed only joy. His heart was full, for he believed that this was the day his life would truly begin. Grace, the bride, was spoken of with admiration by the women who had gathered near the back of the church before her arrival. Her quiet nature and gentle presence had always made her somewhat of a mystery, but on this day, she was the center of admiration. She wore a simple but elegant white gown that flowed gracefully as she walked, and a veil framed her delicate face. The children whispered to one another about how she looked like a princess, while the older women nodded approvingly, some even dabbing their eyes with handkerchiefs at the sight of her taking her place at the door of the sanctuary. All eyes turned to her as the music swelled and the congregation rose to their feet. It seemed as though time itself had slowed, holding its breath in anticipation of vows that would bind two lives together forever. The atmosphere inside the church was filled with warmth, a blend of joy, pride, and the sacredness of the moment. Relatives from both sides smiled knowingly at one another, exchanging glances that spoke of future family bonds. Aunts and uncles whispered blessings, while children fidgeted in their seats, struggling to keep still. The choir's voices rose sweetly, filling every corner of the church with hymns of love and devotion. There was a sense that everything was falling perfectly into place, that nothing could disturb the beauty of this moment. And yet, amidst all the celebration and admiration, there was one pair of eyes that observed more keenly than the rest. The pastor, standing quietly at the altar, wore a kind smile, but within his heart stirred a sense of unease he could not yet explain. He had performed many weddings before, had seen joy and nervousness alike, but something about Grace's expression, fleeting and subtle though it was, whispered to him that this day might not unfold as smoothly as everyone expected. Though no one else seemed to notice, he could not shake the feeling that beneath the surface of all the joy, something was waiting to be revealed. As Grace took her first steps down the aisle, the congregation let out a collective sigh of admiration. Her gown shimmered softly under the light, her veil moving delicately with each step, and her hands clutched the bouquet of lilies so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. From where the guests sat, all they saw was a beautiful bride walking toward the man she loved. But the pastor, standing near the altar, saw something different. Her smile was gentle, yet it flickered at the edges, as though it had been carefully placed upon her face, like a mask. Her eyes shifted nervously from one side of the church to the other, never quite meeting Daniel's gaze for more than a moment. It was subtle, so subtle that most would have overlooked it. But to someone who had guided many through vows of love and faith, the unease was clear. Daniel, beaming with pride, saw none of this. His heart swelled as his bride drew closer, each step filling him with gratitude and hope for the future. To him, her lowered eyes were a sign of modesty, her trembling hands simply the nerves of a bride about to begin a new chapter. His parents, seated in the front pew, clasped each other's hands and whispered prayers of thanksgiving, believing this union was blessed. The guests smiled, some snapping small glances at each other, silently agreeing that Grace looked every bit the radiant bride Daniel deserved. And yet, a few sharp-eyed relatives noticed what the pastor had already sensed. A cousin of Grace leaned over to her sister and whispered, "She doesn't look herself," but the other brushed it off with a shake of the head, convinced it was only nerves. As Grace reached the altar, her smile broadened, but the tension in her eyes did not fade. She stood beside Daniel, and for a moment, their hands touched. Daniel squeezed her fingers, a gesture of comfort, and whispered so softly that only she could hear, "We're finally here." She nodded, forcing a small laugh, but her eyes darted quickly toward the pastor, almost as if she feared what he might see. The pastor offered her a reassuring nod, yet inwardly he felt the stirring of a question that refused to leave his mind. What was hidden behind that uneasy smile? The ceremony pressed on, and the congregation leaned forward with eager hearts, but the pastor's eyes never left the bride. There was something more in her silence, a weight pressing heavily upon her spirit, though she worked hard to conceal it. He had seen brides who cried with joy, brides who trembled with nerves, but this was different. There was a quiet storm in Grace's heart, and though the music filled the church and the voices of the choir rose in harmony, the pastor could not ignore the faint shadow that lingered behind her beauty. It was as though her smile was telling one story, while her eyes whispered another. As the vows began, the church settled into a reverent hush, yet beneath the quiet, there was a subtle stir among the congregation. Those who sat closest to the front noticed the bride's trembling hands as she adjusted her bouquet, the way her voice faltered when she joined the choir in singing the hymn. A few relatives exchanged uneasy glances, whispering to each other in tones so low they were almost swallowed by the music. At first their murmurs were dismissed as the kind of chatter that always weaves through a gathering of family. But as Grace's unease became harder to mask, the whispers grew, moving like a ripple from one pew to another. An elderly aunt, seated near the aisle, leaned toward her neighbor and muttered, "She looks pale, doesn't she?" Almost as if she's unwell. The neighbor, shaking his head, replied, "It's just nerves. Every bride feels this way." But the aunt was unconvinced, her eyes narrowing as she studied Grace's face. From the other side of the room, one of Daniel's cousins whispered to his wife, "She doesn't look happy. Look at her eyes." The wife shushed him quickly, fearful that his words might spread and cast a shadow over the day. Yet, she too could not deny what she saw. The whispers moved quietly, almost unnoticed by Daniel, who stood tall with a hopeful smile, completely absorbed in the joy of the moment. His love for Grace blinded him to the undercurrents of doubt that were beginning to surface among the guests. He saw only the woman he adored, radiant in her white gown, standing beside him at last. For him, the world beyond her presence had faded, leaving only the promise of the life they were about to build together. But not everyone was convinced. There were some who had always regarded Grace with quiet curiosity, her reserved nature leaving many questions unanswered. To those who knew her well, the subtle cracks in her composure raised more questions than they cared to admit. Was she truly ready for this union, or was something troubling her heart? The whispers carried their doubts softly but steadily, like a current flowing beneath the surface of calm waters. The atmosphere, once filled with unshakable joy, began to shift. At the altar, the pastor heard the faint murmur of voices rising and falling, and though he did not turn his head, he knew what was happening. The congregation was sensing what he had seen all along. He lifted his hand slightly to call for silence as the ceremony pressed forward, but within his heart, he could feel the tension growing heavier, as though the truth was straining to break free. What had begun as a day of pure celebration was slowly becoming a moment of quiet unease. shared not just between the pastor and Grace, but now spreading among the very people who had gathered to bless this union. Daniel stood at the altar with a heart so full it threatened to overflow. From the moment Grace appeared at the entrance of the church, his eyes had been fixed on her, drinking in every detail as if to memorize this sacred moment for the rest of his life. He noticed the way her gown flowed behind her, how the sunlight caught the veil that framed her face, and the delicate tremble in her hands. But where others saw unease, Daniel saw beauty. To him, it was the simple fragility of a bride, overwhelmed by the weight of love and the enormity of the vows she was about to take. He smiled at her constantly, his gaze unwavering, as though willing his confidence and joy to steady her. The guests continued to whisper behind him, but Daniel heard none of it. His mind was elsewhere, fixed on memories of how far he and Grace had come to stand in this moment. He thought of the evenings they had spent walking through the town's dusty roads, Grace listening quietly as he spoke of his dreams for the future. He remembered how she had always been more reserved, a woman who guarded her words carefully, yet he took her silence as wisdom rather than distance. Daniel believed he had found in her a partner who balanced his open, hopeful nature with calm steadiness. As he looked at her now, he felt certain that everything he had prayed for was standing right before him. When the pastor spoke of love being patient and kind, Daniel nodded gently, his eyes still locked on Grace, silently telling her that he would embody those words for the rest of their lives. He believed she was nervous only because of the eyes of so many upon her, the weight of the moment pressing upon her shoulders. He wanted to reach out and take her hand, to remind her that she was not alone, that he was with her and always would be. To Daniel, her hesitant smile was a beautiful sign of her vulnerability, proof that she cared deeply about the promises they were about to make. His parents looked on proudly, unaware of the subtle storm brewing beneath Grace's composure. For them, this day was the fulfillment of many prayers, the joining of two families, and the hope of grandchildren who would one day run through their home. Friends in the pews exchanged smiles and nods, admiring Daniel's calm and confident posture. To all who focused on him, there was no doubt he was ready for this union. He was the picture of devotion, a groom whose love was steady and unquestionable. And so, while unease spread quietly among some of the guests, and suspicion lingered in the heart of the pastor, Daniel stood strong, radiating the kind of joy that made it hard to imagine anything could go wrong. To him, this was the day his life was finally beginning, the day all his dreams would take form. He had no idea that just moments later, everything he believed so firmly was about to be tested in a way he could never have imagined. The air inside the church was thick with anticipation as the pastor lifted his hands, ready to guide the couple through the sacred vows. His voice, calm and steady, carried across the pews as he spoke of love, unity, and the divine blessing of marriage. For a time, everything seemed to fall back into place. The whispers quieted. The guests leaned forward in reverence, and Daniel's eyes never left his bride. Yet the pastor, though practiced in composure, could not shake the unease that tugged at him with every glance at Grace. Her smile was present, but it was strained, and her eyes avoided his gaze as though she feared what might be read within them. As the words of the vows began to flow, he noticed the subtle tremor in her lips. When she repeated his phrases, Daniel's voice rang out firm and confident, but Grace's wavered, as though each word carried a weight too heavy for her to bear. The pastor hesitated for just a breath, his instincts warning him that what he was witnessing was more than simple nerves. A silence settled over the church, the kind of silence that prickled at the skin and made people shift in their seats. Guests looked at one another curiously, wondering why the pastor had stopped mid-sentence. For a moment, he closed his book of scripture and simply studied the young woman before him. Grace lowered her head, her fingers tightening around the bouquet, and though she tried to hold steady, a faint tear shimmered at the corner of her eye. It was in that instant the pastor knew that if he continued without addressing what he saw, he would be binding two lives together under a shadow of doubt. He had promised himself long ago that marriage was not a ceremony to be rushed, but a covenant to be entered with truth. And so, though the weight of the congregation's eyes pressed heavily upon him, he chose to act. The pause grew longer, enough for nervous whispers to rise again from the pews. The groom glanced toward the pastor in confusion. His brows furrowed, yet his smile did not falter. Daniel believed perhaps the pastor had lost his place in the book or was giving a dramatic pause for reflection. But Grace knew better. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her breath shallow, and she could not bring herself to meet the pastor's eyes. The congregation waited, some growing restless, others curious, but none expecting what was about to follow. At last, the pastor spoke, his voice low but firm, carrying a weight that silenced every corner of the room. "My daughter," he said gently, his eyes fixed on Grace. "Before we proceed, I must ask you something." His words sent a ripple through the church, and a collective gasp seemed to pass through the rows of guests. Daniel turned fully to his bride, his expression caught between confusion and concern. All at once, the atmosphere shifted. The joy that had filled the church moments earlier now tangled with suspense and unease. Something was stirring, something no one had prepared for, and it was about to change everything. The silence that followed the pastor's question seemed to stretch endlessly. The congregation sat frozen, their eyes darting between the pastor and the bride, unsure of what was unfolding before them. Grace's grip on her bouquet tightened until petals began to bend beneath the pressure of her trembling hands. Daniel, still holding on to hope, leaned closer to her and whispered, "It's all right, love. You can speak." His voice was gentle, filled with reassurance, but his words only made the tears, pooling in her eyes, spill over. The pastor's gaze softened as he asked again, this time more tenderly, "Grace, is there something on your heart that needs to be spoken before we continue?" The words were simple, but they carried a gravity that struck every soul in the room. The whispers that had begun earlier vanished into silence, leaving only the sound of Grace's uneven breathing. She opened her mouth once, then closed it, her body trembling under the weight of what she held inside. Daniel reached for her hand, squeezing it firmly, but this time, she could not return the gesture. With a broken sob, she lowered her bouquet, her voice cracking, as she spoke words that shattered the stillness of the church. "I cannot stand here and let this happen without telling the truth." Gasps erupted among the guests, and all at once the joyous ceremony turned into a moment of shock and disbelief. Daniel's eyes widened, confusion flashing across his face, while the pastor remained calm, waiting for her to continue. Grace's voice wavered, but there was a desperate strength behind it now, a need to finally release the burden she had carried. "I have hidden something," she confessed, her tears falling freely now. "I wanted so badly to begin this new life with Daniel, but I thought if I buried the past, it would disappear. I told myself it would never matter, that no one needed to know. But as I stand here, I cannot speak vows of love while carrying this weight." The guests shifted uneasily, their faces a mixture of pity, judgment, and shock. Some leaned forward, straining to hear every word, while others shook their heads, whispering about betrayal and deceit. Daniel's lips parted, but no words came. He stood utterly still, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for her to finish. The pastor nodded gently, urging her to continue, knowing the truth was the only way forward. Grace lifted her tear-streaked face and finally met Daniel's eyes. Her voice dropped to a trembling whisper, but every soul in the church heard it clearly. "There is something about me that you don't know, something I should have told you long before today." The moment hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. The guests leaned in. Daniel held his breath, and the pastor stood firm. The truth Grace had carried so long was about to break free, and with it, the entire course of this wedding and their lives was about to change forever. Grace's knees weakened, as if the weight of her hidden truth threatened to crush her there at the altar. Her tears flowed freely now, dripping onto the white silk of her gown, leaving small dark stains that seemed to mark the gravity of her words. The bouquet she had clutched so tightly slipped from her trembling hands and fell to the floor with a dull thud, the petals scattering across the polished wood. The congregation held its breath, waiting for the revelation that had turned the joyous occasion into a moment of suspense and dread. With a voice trembling yet urgent, Grace finally spoke the words that had burned in her chest for months. "Daniel," she whispered, "I have not been honest with you. Before we met, I was already married, and though I believed it was over, the truth is, I am not yet free. My past has not been settled, and I should have told you before this day." Her confession cut through the air like a blade. Gasps erupted from the pews, some guests covering their mouths in shock while others muttered in disbelief. Mothers clutched their children close, fathers shook their heads, and relatives exchanged quick, nervous glances. Daniel's face drained of color. He staggered back a half step, his hand slipping from hers as if it burned to the touch. His heart pounded in his chest, each word of her confession ringing in his ears louder than the choir that had filled the church only moments before. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat, and the silence between them grew heavy. All around, whispers spread like wildfire. Some pitied Grace, others condemned her, and still others sat in stunned quiet, unsure of what to feel. The pastor, though, did not move in haste. He raised his hand to quiet the restless congregation and looked at Grace with eyes filled not with judgment but compassion. "My child," he said gently, "truth spoken in tears is far better than silence carried in chains. You have done what many would not have dared, and though the weight of this moment is heavy, truth is the beginning of freedom." His words calmed the room, but they could not soothe the ache in Daniel's heart or erase the devastation etched on his face. Grace's sobs grew louder, her voice cracking with desperation. "I never meant to deceive you. I thought I could start over, that my past would stay buried. But standing here before God and before you, I realized I cannot take vows built on lies. I love you, Daniel, but I could not carry this secret into our marriage." She covered her face with her hands, her body trembling as the last of her strength crumbled. What was meant to be a union of joy had turned into a reckoning of truth. And though the confession had been made, the question lingered in every heart. Present, how would Daniel respond? Would love withstand the weight of betrayal? Or would the dream of this marriage shatter at the very altar where it was meant to begin? For a long moment, Daniel stood in silence, his gaze fixed on Grace, as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. The woman he adored, the one he had dreamt of calling his wife, had just torn open a truth that changed everything. His chest rose and fell heavily, and though he tried to steady his breath, the weight of her words pressed down with unbearable force. Around him, the church seemed to close. In the whispers of the congregation became a low hum in his ears. The bright light from the tall windows felt almost blinding, and his heart pounded so hard it drowned out everything else. Grace, still weeping, reached out timidly, as if to touch his hand. But Daniel pulled back, not in anger, but in shock. His mind raced. He thought of every moment they had shared, every late-night conversation, every promise whispered beneath the stars. How could she have carried such a burden without trusting him to carry it with her? Pain swelled in his chest, but beneath the ache, there was something else, something that had always defined who Daniel was: compassion. Taking a slow, unsteady breath, Daniel turned to the pastor. "Is it true?" His voice was low, almost hoarse, but steady enough to command the attention of the congregation. The pastor gave a solemn nod, confirming that Grace's past was not imagined, not exaggerated, but a truth she had feared to confess until this moment. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, gathering himself, before he looked back at Grace. His words came slowly, carefully, each one pulled from a heart torn between love and disappointment. You should have told me, Grace. I would have listened. I would have stood with you through your past. But this was not the way. Grace sobbed harder, her voice breaking as she cried. I was afraid you would leave me if you knew. Daniel's eyes softened, but his jaw tightened as he fought against the storm inside. I loved you enough to face anything with you, he said quietly. But I never thought the first trial of our marriage would be standing at this altar, learning the truth in front of everyone. His words carried no malice, only the raw pain of a man caught between betrayal and the love that still refused to let go. The congregation was silent now, leaning forward, straining to hear every word. Some expected Daniel to walk away, to cast aside the woman who had deceived him. Others hoped he would take her in his arms and show the strength of forgiveness. The weight of expectation pressed down on him from every side. Yet, in that moment, Daniel looked only at Grace. His eyes, though wounded, were filled with a sorrowful tenderness that revealed the depth of his heart. Finally, he whispered, I don't know what tomorrow holds, Grace. I don't know if I can forget what you've done, but I do know this love is not built on secrets. If we are to move forward, it must be with honesty, no matter how painful it is. His words hung heavy in the air, not a final judgment, but the opening of a path only honesty and time could carve. The guests shifted uneasily, their emotions torn between admiration for his restraint and sorrow for his pain. At that moment, it became clear that Daniel's decision would not just define their wedding day, it would redefine both of their lives. The stillness that followed Daniel's words was almost suffocating. The congregation, once united in joyful celebration, now sat fractured, their faces painted with conflicting emotions. In one corner, a group of Grace's relatives shook their heads in disapproval, whispering sharply about how she had shamed her family by hiding such a truth until this very moment. It should never have come to this, one aunt muttered bitterly, clutching her shawl as though to shield herself from the disgrace. Another relative murmured, she should have trusted him before. Now she has humiliated herself and all of us. Their words, though hushed, carried a sting that lingered in the air. On the other side of the church, some of Daniel's friends and neighbors leaned toward one another, voices laced with pity rather than judgment. Poor girl, one woman whispered. The fear must have been unbearable. To hide something so heavy, it must have eaten her alive. Her companion nodded softly, adding, at least she spoke the truth before it was too late. That takes courage, no matter how painful. They looked toward Grace, their eyes filled with a quiet compassion, seeing not just her mistake, but the bravery in her confession. Still others remained undecided, caught between the sharp edge of betrayal and the tender hope of forgiveness. Some guests folded their arms, whispering that the wedding should be called off at once, while others prayed silently that Daniel's heart would find strength enough to forgive. The divide was evident not only in the murmurs but in the body language of the crowd. Some leaned forward, eager to see what would happen next, while others recoiled in discomfort, unwilling to witness the unraveling of a love story before their very eyes. Children fidgeted in confusion, tugging at their mothers' sleeves to ask why the bride was crying. Parents hushed them quickly, not wanting to speak of matters too heavy for innocent ears. Older members of the community exchanged solemn glances, their expressions marked with the wisdom of age. They knew that love was never simple, that secrets and trials often tested the very foundations of a union. But they also knew the choice that lay ahead for Daniel was one that would echo for the rest of his life. The pastor, standing at the altar, sensed the division among the people. With calm authority, he raised his hand once more, and slowly the murmurs quieted. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of what had just transpired. Today, he said, we are reminded that marriage is not only a joining of two hearts, but also a test of truth and forgiveness. Let us not sit in judgment, but in prayer. For what is decided here will shape the lives of Daniel and Grace forever. His words settled heavily over the congregation, yet they did little to erase the tension that rippled through the pews. What began as a day of laughter and joy had transformed into a moment of reckoning, dividing the hearts of those present. Some believed Grace's mistake had ruined the sanctity of the union. Others believed her courage to confess had given their love a chance to begin in truth. All waited breathlessly for the final outcome, for what would be said and done at the altar, where the past and future now collided. The church stood in silence, every soul waiting to see how the story would end. Grace, her tears slowing, but her body still trembling, stood exposed before her groom and her community, the weight of her past now laid bare. Daniel's face, though marked with hurt, carried a quiet strength as he turned to look at her once more. The pastor, steady and compassionate, allowed the pause to linger, for he knew this moment would not be remembered by the grandeur of the decorations or the sweetness of the choir, but by the choice made at this very altar. Daniel took a step closer to Grace, his voice soft but resolute. "Grace," he said, "you should have trusted me with the truth sooner, and my heart aches because you did not. But you have chosen to speak now, and that matters. Love without honesty cannot survive, but love that begins in truth, even when it is painful, has the chance to endure." The congregation leaned in, their hearts pulled taut with anticipation. Grace's eyes widened with disbelief as she looked into his face, searching for anger but finding only sorrow mingled with compassion. The pastor nodded approvingly, his voice calm as he addressed them both. Marriage is not the absence of flaws, but the joining of two souls who choose to walk in truth. If you are to continue, it must be with eyes wide open, with forgiveness and honesty guiding your path. His words hung in the air, a reminder to everyone present that love was more than celebration. It was sacrifice, patience, and the courage to forgive. Some in the congregation shifted uncomfortably, whispering that Daniel should walk away, that no man should bear such a burden on his wedding day. But others bowed their heads, tears filling their eyes at the grace unfolding before them. They recognized that love, when tested, revealed its truest form, not in perfect joy, but in how it endured through pain. At last, Daniel reached for Grace's hand. For the first time that day, she did not try to hide. She let him take it, her tears spilling again as she whispered, "I don't deserve your forgiveness." He shook his head gently, replying, "None of us deserve grace, yet it is given. Let us build from here, not in secrets, but in truth." His words brought a hush over the church, and for the first time since her confession, Grace managed a genuine smile, small but real, born of relief rather than pretense. The pastor closed his eyes briefly in prayer, then opened them with renewed strength. "Then let this union not be marked by deceit, but by redemption. Today we have witnessed not a perfect love, but a true one." With that, he lifted his hands and continued the vows. This time, Grace's voice was steady, her eyes fixed on Daniel, with honesty she had long withheld. Daniel's responses were firm, his tone no longer just joyful, but rooted in conviction. When the pastor declared them husband and wife, the congregation rose to their feet, not in simple applause, but in awe of what they had seen. Some still shook their heads, others smiled with tears, but all left that church knowing they had witnessed something extraordinary. What began as a day nearly ruined by secrets was transformed into a testimony of truth, forgiveness, and the enduring power of love.